Part 32. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 317. The fat man finally got in the car and went to the Terracotta Warriors and Horses Historical Museum together. This time we visited the real place, the feeling at the door and the rows of security personnel, including the endless stream of tourists and various foreign tour groups nearby. Wait, it all shows one thing: this is the real Terracotta Warriors and Horses History Museum, no longer the fake one before. This time, it was Subai who went to buy the tickets, because Subai could see that the fat man was already losing interest. In fact, the Terracotta Warriors and Horses are magical to say the least. After all, they are cultural relics inherited from 2000 years ago, with strong historical and cultural factors. For most people, it would be a pity not to see the Terracotta Warriors and Horses when they come to Xi'an. It's like I've never been here before, but, to put it bluntly, the Terracotta Warriors and Horses are clay sculptures of Terracotta Warriors and Horses, tattered clay figurines. There are always a few people who really love history, and most people will feel that after watching it, that's all, very disappointing. Let's go, I bought the ticket, do you want to go in? Subai waved the ticket in front of the fat man. Should I go to the tomb of Emperor Qin first or see the Terracotta Warriors and Horses? This is a combined ticket. Can we see Qin Shi Huang's coffin at the Emperor Qin's tomb? The fat man suddenly became interested. Subai shook his head. It's just a mound and a green scenic area. There is a place for sightseeing buses. Get on it and check in. It will take you around for a while, but you can't actually see anything, just flowers and plants. Forget it, let's go in and see the clay figures first. The fat man dejectedly checked in with Subai and entered the real Terracotta Warriors and Horses History Museum. From the entrance to the exit, there was a long path, and then they reached the real museum area. A real historical relic carries its own charm and thoughts. Even the fat man, who was originally a little unmotivated, has become much more serious at this time. After walking into pit number 1, the fat man stood by the railing and looked at the array of Terracotta Warriors and Horses in front of him. He took a deep breath and remained motionless for a long time. Then he looked at Subai. Sure enough, it still seems to have feelings. It is indeed different. The man who discovered the Terracotta Warriors and Horses is called Lao Yang, right? He was quite interesting. He actually reported it to the country instead of keeping it for himself. In fact, the local area has a long history of selling smuggled cultural relics, and it has not stopped even after the founding of the People's Republic of China. But the blame is on Lao Yang, who created a whole lot of them back then. Even if he wanted to change hands, it was too unsightly and he couldn't move out. Nen was pulled by an ox cart and sent to the door of the county government. Later, the country discovered this place and began to pay attention to management, which can be regarded as cutting off a shortcut for local people to make a fortune. After the two people walked around pit number 1, they went to hall number 2. In hall number 2, there were several complete Terracotta Warriors and Horses displayed in glass cabinets. The fat man walked up to a Terracotta Warriors and Horses and subconsciously took out his mobile phone to take a photo. Subai stood beside the fat man. He was originally going out to play with the fat man. Subai's mentality was also very relaxed. In addition, this place itself, I had been here before, so there wasn't much freshness. However, just as the flash of Fatty's cell phone flashed away, Subai's eyes suddenly jumped, as if he saw something he shouldn't have seen. Subai subconsciously looked around. There were many tourists around, speaking dialects from various places and even languages from various countries, admiring everything here. After taking the photo, the fat man went to look at Subai. When he saw Subai's serious expression, he was stunned for a moment. Dabai, what's wrong? After looking around, he found nothing special. Subai began to wonder if the side effects of taking the medicine made him feel a little dazed. However, at this time, A foreigner next to him took a camera and clicked again. Sudbai frowned immediately. Someone was looking at him, and he was peeping at him. His body turned in a circle. Hall 2 actually seemed a bit empty, but it was also deeper. "What's wrong?" Fatty asked again. "Someone is observing us in the dark," Sudbai said firmly, "twice, it can't be my imagination." Fatty immediately calmed down his mind and calmed down to experience it together. However, it may be that Fatty had much fewer spiritual opportunities than Sudbai, so he was worse than Sudbai in some spiritual fields, so he didn't feel anything strange. However, Fatty didn't believe that Sudbai felt wrong, because often in many horror stories or horror movies, the person who senses danger around him would say that you must have seen it wrong, you are overly concerned, and you are suspicious. Often the first one to die. "Take your phone and take another photo," Sudbai said. Yeah, the fat man picked up the phone very cooperatively and pressed the shutter on the terracotta warriors and horses in the mirror. Click. "Here we go again." This time, Sudbai reacted very quickly. He was feeling it with his eyes closed, so he immediately chased the instinctive feeling and turned around his body. Then, he slowly opened his eyes. This moment, Sudbai found himself standing facing the terracotta warriors and horses in the mirror, and his eyes were meeting the dark pupil recesses of the terracotta warriors and horses. Flush. It's here. Actually here. Inside this terracotta warriors and horses, or rather, it is this terracotta warriors and horses. In an instant, Sudbai finally remembered the real reason why he came to Xi'an, and finally got out of the relaxing state of tourism. Xi'an now is a graveyard for listeners. This is still a tourist city for ordinary people, but for listeners, it is scary and dangerous, because most of the Shaanxi listeners with a mission completion score of 5 or above have perished in the surrounding areas of Xi'an in a short period of time. The fat man followed Sudbai's gaze and swallowed. "Is this it?" Sudbai nodded. "But this is a national treasure. Wanton destruction of a national treasure can easily cause consequences, which is similar to killing many people." "Fat man, set up a formation to block the sight and attention of other people around you. Regardless of whether it is a national treasure or not, I will definitely get rid of this thing today." "Do you think we can leave safely if you don't see it?" Sudbai said firmly. The fat man nodded and stopped being vague and hesitant. He threw out a few coins and recited a spell silently, forming a small barrier that blocked the attention of everyone around him. One of Sudbai's hands turned into a zombie, and then he used the zombie's sharp nails to cut a circle on the glass. Sudbai's hand reached in and was about to touch the head of the terracotta warriors and horses. At this moment, a change occurred, and the outer shell of the terracotta warriors and horses began to fall off. Then, a bloody corpse covered in red appeared in front of Fatty and Sudbai. The bloody corpse opened its mouth and let out a kind of wail, as if with endless fear and panic. It squatted down in the glass frame. Small bubbles began to appear from up and down the body, and then pus and blood began to flow out. Sudbai's hand was still suspended in mid-air, but the bloody corpse had completely melted away. The fat man swallowed, turned around and looked at Sudbai, only to find that the person standing in front of him was not Sudbai, but a bloody corpse. What stood in the glass frame was no longer terracotta warriors or blood. But Sudbai looked equally shocked. What are you doing?" The fat man gave a low drink, and a piece of talisman appeared in his palm. The next moment, the talisman was attached to the forehead of the blood corpse. But then, Sudbai found that the blood corpse had turned into Sudbai again. The terracotta warriors and horses in the glass frame are still terracotta warriors and horses, and nothing seems to have changed at all. "What's going on? What's going on?" The fat man took a few steps back in a daze, and the copper coin formation also dissipated. The tourists around him came and went and kept walking in front of the fat man, but the fat man felt more and more in a trance. Looking around, Sudbai suddenly disappeared. The glass frame became empty, with a piece of paper pasted on the outside. This exhibit is currently on tour abroad. Sudbai, Dabai. The fat man started shouting, and many tourists around him cast surprised looks. Asphyxia. Asphyxia. Terrible suffocation. When Sudbai regained his sight and hearing, he was shocked to find that he was standing in the middle of pit number 1. Pit number 1, or pavilion number 1, contained the largest number of terracotta warriors and horses, and was also the most spectacular. The rest of the pavilions were even better than pavilion number 1. The pit lacks a lot of momentum and meaning, but at this time, among the various terracotta warriors and horses, there is a terracotta warrior and horse that is trembling imperceptibly. That's Sudbai. He wanted to break free from the shackles around him and break away from this suffocating oppression, but everything seemed to be a useless effort. His body had become extremely stiff, as if he already had existence and perseverance here. For 2,000 years. The change came too suddenly, too unexpectedly, without any foreshadowing, without the slightest warning. It just happened, it just started. Even though Sudbai and Fatty were standing together, the two of them were instantly completely playful and segmented. In a daze, Sudbai saw Fatty's figure appearing in pit number 1. He started running and searching. Sudbai knew clearly that Fatty was looking for him. Fatty must also be very scared at this time. But Sudbai couldn't make a sound or give a hint, so the fat man ran past him in the aisle beside him, not noticing him at all. Sudbai wanted to adjust his sight. At the same time, a thick white fog rose in the entire pit number 1. The densely packed tourists surrounding the railing seemed to be unable to see the thick fog at all. They continued to visit these places. Terracotta warriors and horses. In the thick fog, Sudbai found that his body was no longer a terracotta warrior, but he still couldn't move. Moreover, his body was dripping with blood, and the blood kept dripping down, maintaining a standing posture. Before, after, and around oneself. They are no longer terracotta warriors and horses. There were men, women, and children, all standing on the same spot as Sudbai, but their blood had turned black and dried up, and they had obviously been dead for a long time. However, there were still traces of blood on the bodies of these people that should not be underestimated. Breath. A bolt of lightning flashed through Sudbai's mind. These people must not be the Shaanxi listeners who suddenly died en masse recently. Could it be said that someone is specifically following the example of the first emperor in building the terracotta warriors and horses for himself, specifically hunting down the audience as burial objects for himself? Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 318. All around, the corpses all have the same posture, attitude, and even expression. Under the dried blood and dirty colored ground, there are piles of earth. They are like burial objects of the terracotta warriors and horses, fixed here by inexplicable power. Further around, there are other unearthed terracotta warriors and horses. They are located in the middle. It's inconspicuous, and ordinary people outside can't see the scene here at all. If all the fallen listeners in Shaanxi died here, then would my luck be too bad? Sudbai couldn't help but smile in his heart. He brought the fat man to Tong to see the terracotta warriors and horses, but he happened to step into their home. It was really like heaven, but he couldn't take the right path, and hell had no way to break in. The body twisted and stretched to the maximum extent, but at most it could only tremble a little, and could not move at all. However, the skills of the body continued to flow out and be introduced into the earth below. Blood is just a manifestation of the flow of vitality. In fact, at this time, all kinds of power in Sudbai's body are constantly disappearing and being extracted. Perhaps, this process is really comparable to any horrific torture in the world, especially when there are so many dead predecessors around you who are giving you demonstrations and silently telling you that you will be dead soon. Will look like them. Breathing began to become more and more difficult, and my chest felt oppressive. My whole body was like a sponge, being squeezed crazily, and all the water in the sponge was flowing out. Surrounded by funerary objects that had been silent for more than 2 years, they exuded the atmosphere of vicissitudes of life. However, Subai did not want to be one of them and be placed here forever and unknown to anyone in the future. However, Subai was not destined to be lonely, because soon, a person appeared in the slightly empty space on Subai's left side. That person was the fat man. The fat man's posture was the same as Subai's, just standing like this, motionless, but blood was constantly flowing out of his body. Subai could see that the fat man was trembling slightly. It should be that he was struggling like he did before, but in the end can't move. The fat man also discovered Subai. Now, the two of them seemed to have only their eyeballs left to move a little freely. However, the vitality in their bodies was constantly passing by. This feeling was as if there was an alarm clock placed above their heads. The ground was ticking, indicating the day of his death. There is no way to resist, and no way to resist. Everything seems to be completely destined. Subai can't do anything even if he wants to flip the table and get sick at this time. People are suppressing you, controlling you, not giving you any space. Know if you are given the slightest chance, the pressure coming from all directions will bring you close to suffocation. For some reason, Subai really felt that his brain circuit was a little different from other people's. He was originally feeling very uncomfortable and desolate, but because he had someone he knew, Fatty, to die slowly with him, he suddenly felt that it wasn't that bad. Time is passing slowly. Fatty, oh no, Fatty has become thinner. His whole body has lost a lot of weight, and the skin on his body has also fallen down, like a harpy dog. Subai also knew that he was almost the same. His body had begun to wither. This was not a switch to zombie state, but a manifestation of the vitality in the body being continuously extracted. Death is getting closer and closer, it is very possible. Next moment. It's 0 point. However, at this moment, a trembling sound came from deep underground, as if a sleeping person slowly woke up, with a hint of anger and dissatisfaction. At this moment, Subai suddenly felt his body light up, and immediately he used his last bit of strength to jump back. Buzz, 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 buzz. There was a constant buzzing sound in his head. When he opened his eyes, Subai found himself sitting in front of the exhibition glass cabinet. There was a sign inside that said this exhibit is currently on tour in foreign countries. His body staggered and he sat on the ground. Many tourists around him exclaimed, and soon the museum management staff rushed over, lifted Subai up and sent him to the infirmary in the museum. The smell of alcohol disinfectant hit him, and Subai's consciousness almost fell into a coma, and he could only be at the mercy of others. After seemingly simple treatment, Subai was sent to the ambulance, and the journey was bumpy. In the middle, Subai completely lost consciousness and fell into a coma. Not knowing how long he slept, Subai woke up leisurely. It was dark outside and he was lying on the hospital bed. In the bed next to him was an old acquaintance. The fat man was lying there still awake and snoring. The tearing pain in his head kept coming, and the nausea and dizziness kept coming, which made Subai feel irritable. Meditate, a calm voice came. Subai turned his head slightly and saw the monk slowly walking towards the door of the ward carrying a lunch box. Putting the lunch box on the small table of the hospital bed, the monk sighed, "Your energy and blood loss is too serious. Don't be agitated at this time, otherwise there will be deeper problems with your body's functions. Although I don't know how you recovered, the injury also came to Zien, but I should be sure that you don't want to continue to be paralyzed on the chair or bed like before, right?" Subai smiled bitterly and nodded. The monk raised the bed and placed 2 pillows behind Subai. "What's in there?" Subai asked. Obviously, he was able to escape because the monk and Gyatso happened to arrive and did something. The monk shook his head. "The poor monk doesn't know. He found some clues about the existence of Swanyun Temple in the archives, but the record above is that Swanyun Temple was built in the area where Liao Yang discovered the terracotta warriors and horses. The history of Swanyun Temple is naturally much shorter than that of the terracotta warriors and horses. Therefore, in order to better protect the cultural relics of the Qin dynasty more than 2,000 years ago, the country demolished Swanyun Temple. The abbot at that time was merged with a bunch of monks. Instead of asking the country to relocate him, he just disappeared. Then how did you rescue us? Subai was a little confused about this. What he felt at that time was a power that completely crushed him. He didn't even have room to resist, but the monk actually, it's really amazing to have the ability to save myself. We also want to admit that we rescued you so that you too owe me a favor, but the problem is, we didn't rescue you. Gyatso walked in with a bottle of boiling water in his hand, and after finding the clues, Killa went directly to the Terracotta Warriors and Horses History Museum. But when we first entered, we encountered an accident and saw some weird things. In fact, maybe in a short while, Killa and I will become you and Fatty. It was the same, but at that time, a certain being deep underground suddenly seemed to wake up, or seemed to be full and planned to turn over and continue sleeping. Therefore, he was unwilling to eat at this time and gave up on us. I guess likewise, I gave up on you and Fatty. Is this your explanation? Subai smiled. It sounds like nonsense. The fat man woke up before you once and told us some things. He should have been sucked into that place a little later than you, so he lost less energy and blood than you did. Those corpses arranged in a row should, not surprisingly, be the fallen local listeners in Shaanxi. Now it is obvious that there is a terrible guy here who hunts the listeners to replenish his own vitality, and also made them into something similar to the tomb of the first emperor. The model of the terracotta warriors and horses is really big enough. In fact, what Gyatso means is, if he acts so unscrupulously, why is that being not afraid of terrorist broadcasts? If we really did it because he was full and wanted to rest and refine the vitality he had absorbed before, do we have to thank him for not killing him when we see him in the future? Subai joked. Theoretically, this is indeed the case, the monk added. Subai breathed a long sigh of relief. This matter is completely beyond our control. So we are ready to leave. The monk opened the lunch box, which was filled with shredded potatoes and rice. The temple is gone, and all the former brothers and elders are probably gone. The poor monk is planning to leave. Subai suddenly thought of his real mission, and suddenly felt that it was so ironic. The monk was clearly determined to come to this incident at the beginning, but now the monk and the others were planning to leave, and he, a person who had never planned to come in the first place, could not leave. Do you still have the cigarettes in my pocket? Light one for me, Subai said. Gyatso didn't say anything like this was a ward, and helped Subai light a cigarette. Exhaling a smoke ring, Subai said helplessly, you should leave first. I have to hang out here for a while. I have received a real-life mission, and it is the kind of real-life mission that cannot be ignored or filtered out. One of the missions you just have to stay in Xi'an for a certain amount of time. Don't delay, tell the fat man to get up and leave Shaanxi first. After Subai finished speaking, he struggled to get up. He walked quite easily in a patient's uniform. Why go? Gyatso asked. Go to the bathroom. Subai reached out and took his cell phone from the closet. After walking out of the ward, he came to the men's room on this floor. He opened a squat cubicle and closed the door. Before Subai could squat down, his cell phone rang. When he clicked on it, Subai was surprised to find that there were 3 people there. There were more than a dozen missed calls, and the caller was from the landline in his detective agency. Something happened at home? Subai immediately answered the phone. Hello. Meow. An auspicious voice came from the other end of the phone, as if he was coquettishly speaking. Ever since Jixiang followed him, Subai had never seen Jixiang make such a coquettish sound like a pet cat. You're out of your mind, Damn cat, Subai cursed. Meow, meow. Jixiang continued to call meekly. Slowly, Subai swallowed uncontrollably. An idea suddenly rose in his mind. Then, he subconsciously looked down. In the squatting pit, there is a human face. A human face covered in blood from lost human skin was staring at him indifferently. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 319. What the hell, Subai looked at the faces below and couldn't help but say this. The memory of the previous pain was still very clear, but this bloody corpse actually appeared in front of him again, so suddenly. It seems that its scope of activities is not that small, and it is not just a corner of the Terracotta Warriors and Horses Museum. Thinking about it, it is impossible for the audience in Shaanxi to meet up and organize an audience salon and then organize a group to go to the Terracotta Warriors and Horses Museum to pay homage to the historical relics of the Chinese nation. Moreover, its appearance here now can also explain what the monk said before, that it was full, so it vomited out the four of itself. This conclusion must be wrong. It is not good to stay in one place after eating. What's the point of wandering around with so much vitality in slow digestion? The bloody corpse pulled itself out of the squatting pit in a very twisted way. Subai did not resist, and even raised his hands to indicate that he would not resist. Now Subai's head is still dizzy, and his body is filled with blood. A serious loss. He had just experienced the horror of this bloody corpse, so Subai expressed his attitude in this way. This may be a bit cowardly. But when I think about the fate that I, Fatty and Monk should have turned into mummies standing together with the Terracotta Warriors and Horses, now that I and others are still alive, it all depends on the wishes of the bloody corpse in front of me, so, it seems to be a little timid. It's also normal. This bloody corpse is the most terrifying existence that Subai has encountered since becoming a listener, and the one that makes him feel most powerless. When he faced Lan Linyan Huiyang or Pialo before, Subai knew how powerful they were, but still he had the courage to take action against them, but facing this bloody corpse, Subai felt for the first time that his resistance was so pale. Might as well, save your energy. The bloody corpse's hand slowly reached over and took the phone from Subai's hand. Subai was very cooperative and didn't resist. He let the other party take his cell phone. The blood corpse's movements seemed very stiff and unnatural, which meant that it actually had no memory or habit of doing things that humans had done for a long time. Meow meow meow. The bloody corpse put the phone to his ear. The whole action gave people a numb scalp feeling, but Subai could feel that it was listening seriously, really seriously. At the same time, the auspicious voice on the other end of the phone was even more, so happy, it's a bit ridiculous. As if Subai had thought of some possibility, he stared at the bloody corpse in front of him with his eyes wide open. He slowly pointed his finger at it, opened his mouth, and slowly uttered a few words. Who are you? Subai couldn't help being shocked, couldn't help Subai not being horrified, because if it was really what he thought, then this matter would be really serious, and it had just pulled itself out of the pit. It was hard for Subai to imagine what would happen to that person. He was so informal and did things that came out of such a place without any hesitation. Just when the person's name was about to be spat out, the bloody corpse suddenly shuddered and immediately grabbed Subai's neck with one hand, lifting Subai's whole body up. While his neck was being pinched, Subai felt the force coming from all directions. The pressure on the ground, not only his body, but also his soul was tightly restrained. Ahem, you, ahem. The phone in the blood corpse's hand exploded at this moment. It was crushed by her own hands. Then she waved her hand and Subai felt her body light up. She was thrown out and actually penetrated the wall. Arriving outside the hospital building, he fell directly into a pond behind the hospital building. Boom! The water splashed, and about 5 seconds later, Subai came up and wiped his face with his hand. The wall of the toilet above was intact, but he was indeed thrown out like this. Through the air? Subai recalled in his mind the scene when he was switching between Hall 2 and Hall 1 of the Terracotta Warriors and Horses Museum. It seemed to be correct. All of this was caused by this bloody corpse. Climbing out of the pond, he was completely soaked. He found a rockery and sat down on it. Subai kept breathing heavily. In his mind, everything from the auspicious cries to the blood corpse picking up the phone was going on. Movements continued to emerge, and Subai felt that he had torn away some of the fog, but he still couldn't understand anything clearly. If it was that person, why did it become like this? This is really hard to imagine and unimaginable. Or does Jixiang know this person? But with Jixiang's cold and cold temperament, it's impossible. Holding his head with both hands, Subai gritted his teeth. Suddenly, he had the feeling that he had been deliberately tricked into the horror broadcast. He could only be regarded as insignificant to the entire audience circle, including the horror broadcast. Character, then why did the terrorist broadcast deliberately force me to come to Xi'an when I was still seriously injured? You know, at that time, there was Fatty Monk and the others under the same roof. Their injuries were not serious, but the terrorist broadcast still wanted to specifically look for you? Why is that? Is it really because the horror broadcast looks at me differently? Is it really because horror broadcasting is particularly optimistic about itself? Subai knows one truth, that is, Pi will not fall from the sky. If Pi does fall, it will kill people. What is the purpose of terror broadcasts? Also, the omnipotent horror broadcast seems to be a bit too cumbersome in this matter, which makes Subai a little unaccustomed and a little unbelievable. In the perception of Subai and most of the listeners, horror broadcasting is the supreme existence, the almighty existence, the omnipotent existence. Terrorist radio can know whatever it wants to know, and whatever it wants to do can be done immediately. There is no need for it to go around in circles to achieve any purpose, because the whole world, whether it is the story world or the real world, for horror broadcasts, the farthest distance is nothing more than the distance from your left hand to your right hand. Standing up and dragging his wet body, Subai planned to go back to the ward in Xi'an. Damn it, Subai has been going to the toilet for so long and hasn't come back yet. Isn't this boy constipated? Don't tell me, it's really possible. When he was a young master, he ate delicacies from the mountains and seas. That's called exquisiteness. Now that I am a working family, I only eat home-cooked food, so my stomach may not be used to it, the fat man yelled while leaning on the hospital bed while eating. The monk and Gyatso were sitting on chairs. Both monks had calm faces. For the monk, the temple is completely gone, and he has nothing to cling to. It is better to leave Xi'an as soon as possible, a place of right and wrong for the audience. Besides, for Gyatso, this time it is considered a near miss, but there is really no need to stay here and take risks, because there are no obvious benefits at all, not even vague benefits. The 3 people in the ward were all exposed to the terrifying existence of that existence, so they were basically similar to Subai. They knew that if they encountered that existence again, there would really be no big difference between resisting and not resisting. They are really not qualified to intervene in matters of this level now. The fat man was depleted of energy and blood and wanted to eat meat, but the monk just bought him a few bowls of lean meat porridge. The monk was proficient in medical science and knew that relying on the instinctive desire to eat big fish and meat at this time would be destructive to the body's functions. This hospital is so shabby. There is no private bathroom. The fat man drank another bowl of porridge and continued, the public toilets in the corridor always remind me of the ghost stories I read when I was a child. Seeing that Gyatso and the monk were silent, they were obviously not very interested in this topic. The fat man, who received no response, continued to talk on his own. I used to have a buddy who lived in a school dormitory. There was a public toilet in the corridor. There was no private bathroom in the dormitory. One night he went to use the toilet. There were rows of squatting pits, one after another. He was squatting there to defecate. It was in the middle of the night. The toilet lights were also voice activated and a bit dim. When he was enjoying himself, there was a sound coming from the pit in front of him. A voice came and asked to borrow some tissue paper. They were all classmates, so my buddy didn't say anything, he just said yes. Then the person in the pit in front stretched his hand over from the side, and the guy separated part of his own piece of tissue paper and handed it over. Then when he continued to pull, he suddenly remembered something, that is, the distance between the squatting pit and the squatting pit was very close, that is, it was only separated by a thin cement glass brick, but the squatting pit had a partition on the side. That kind of toilet, when other people go into the toilet and see the person squatting inside, they can see that person's head but not the shameful parts of the back half of the body. Therefore, if the person squatting in the front wants to reach out from the side and ask for toilet paper from the person squatting in the back, it is basically impossible. My buddy was so scared that he peed. Well, it was easy for him to pee at that time, and he immediately wiped his butt a few times and got ready to leave. But when he just pulled up his pants and stood up, the toilet started to flush. The squatting thing in front of him was also rushed over, and he saw a human face passing through his crotch, and it was rolled down along with the feces and urine. The man smiled at him, as if thanking him for borrowing it. Like papyrus. After listening to the story, the monk suddenly said, "Jongbei, this is your personal experience. Because of your physical constitution and the fact that your family is a Taoist family, you have been able to channel spirits since you were very young. It's easy to see those unclean things. Whatever you think." The fat man stopped arguing. At this time, Subai, who was soaked all over, opened the door and walked in. Dabai, did you fall into the toilet?" Fatty exclaimed. Gyatso and the monk also looked at Subai in surprise. Subai pursed his lips, "I saw." Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 320. Subai opened his mouth and wanted to say the name, but in an instant, he suddenly recalled the feeling when the blood corpse strangled his neck before, and the voice before the terror broadcast appeared in his mind. In a daze, Subai felt like he had grasped something important. He shook his head and sat down beside his hospital bed. The sheets were soon wetted by the water stains on Subai's body. The ward also fell into a kind of silence. The fat man stopped eating. He put his lunch box aside, fumbled for his own cigarette, threw one to Subai, and then lit it himself. Subai held a cigarette, looked at everyone in the ward, and shook his head. "I saw something I can't say." "Can't say?" The monk frowned slightly, as if he was understanding the deeper meaning of Subai's words. At the same time, his left hand began to pinch and move, as if he was deducing something, but he soon gave up. Obviously the monk himself knows that this kind of thing is no longer something he can deduce. The reason why he does this action is actually a habit. "I can't say it because it's dangerous to say it," Gyatso said at this time. "We have a fable in Tibetan Buddhism, which tells this kind of story. It means that the Buddha told a person a secret and told this person people should not tell it, but after experiencing a lot of things, the longer the time goes by, the more this person wants to tell the secret. But fortunately, he had been listening to the Buddha's teachings and endured it. But when he was old and dying, his bed was surrounded by his children. He finally couldn't help it and told the secret, and then he was surrounded by people in the room. All his relatives died suddenly in front of him." "Gyatso, why do you think this story is so evil?" "Grimm's fairy tales, Aesop's fables and the like, are all about depth and meaning," the fat man said. Gyatso smiled and said, "If telling this secret will cause a lot of trouble, I still suggest that it is better to do less than to do more. The water here is too deep and it will easily drown us. Subai leaned on the hospital bed and pursed his lips. The listeners in Shaanxi have been killed for the most part. In the real world, the listeners are killed so openly, but the horror broadcast still sends me, an insignificant character, here. Isn't it too contrary to common sense? Already. Moreover, someone could be so blatantly provoking a terrorist broadcast without being punished. Subai, you once told me about a person who went abroad and destroyed a city, the monk suddenly said. Didn't that person also survive in the end? The nature of the matter is somewhat different. Subai rubbed his hands unnaturally. Blood corpses, terracotta warriors, and horses, a group of dead Shaanxi listeners, the mission given to me by terror broadcast. Don't you think it's strange? The monk frowned when he heard this. Gyatso also fell into deep thought. The fat man's cigarette butt almost burned his fingers, but he didn't notice it yet. The 4 people in the ward are not stupid people. In fact, except for Subai, they are all ambitious people. What you mean is that the horror broadcast actually doesn't know who this person is. Therefore, there is probably a bug in the horror broadcast here. It is omniscient and omnipotent and met a person it does not know. This also led to many horror broadcasts. These countermeasures cannot be implemented anymore. It's like a program. If the code is written wrong at the beginning, the program triggered by many situations will not be started successfully. This is why terror broadcast has not had strong countermeasures for a long time. In fact, it itself is also very confused. I am also very hesitant, I am also very doubtful, even, I am actually at a loss. The fat man put out the cigarette butt and said these analyses, and then a flush of excitement appeared on his face. Isn't this very interesting? Horror broadcasts, the omniscient and omnipotent God, can actually encounter this kind of bug. It's so interesting, but how did that bloody corpse do it? It should be that some special method was used, the monk analyzed. It directly led to the terrorist broadcast being unable to really determine the identity of the blood corpse. The terrorist broadcast treated us as chess pieces that could be played with at will, but why didn't we use a kind of toy? Do you have the mentality of a difficult game to face the horror broadcast? The poor monk believes that that person is probably equivalent to a player who has really played this game to the limit. He knows about this bug and is now using it. That's really interesting, Fatty muttered. No, this level is a bit high. They are directly playing with the horror broadcast. Who is it? I really admire it. Hee, but, you say it will last long. Obviously, for Fatty, or for every listener, the shadow of the horror broadcast has been implanted deep in the heart, and it is difficult to erase or change. It won't last long, Subai said. Don't forget, the horror broadcast was suspended for several months in order to rectify some mistakes it made in the story world. Therefore, the horror broadcast cannot be compared to a TV series. It is a permanent and unchanging program that has the ability to discover and handle bugs on its own, and it has the awareness and initiative to improve and patch itself. That's right. Terrorist radio is not a dead thing, but why did that person do this? The fat man asked. The monk came over at this time, packed up the lunch box and prepared to take it out to wash. As a listener, if you are not forced to that step, who would be willing to confront the horror broadcast? Monk, have you decided when to leave? Subai asked. Let's go to Chongqing first for the evening flight, at least stay away from Shaanxi first. The monk looked at Subai. You stay here alone, be careful. The monk also knew that Subai had a real mission, so Subai could not leave the vicinity of Xian. Subai nodded. You should also be careful. The monk went to wash the lunch box, while Gyatso went out to handle some things, such as air tickets and hospitalization procedures. Fatty and Subai were the only ones left in the ward. The fat man took a carton of milk, took 2 sips, and sighed. Dabai, you said this life is really painful. I used to feel that being in society was quite tiring. Everyone in front of me and behind me looked slumped, and I didn't know what to do. When I get older, I always feel that I will no longer be able to survive as I get older, and I will just look that slovenly. Not to mention my children, I may not even have the money to go to a nursing home by then. Later, when I became an audience member, I felt that life was different. I had become a god, haha. But later on, I realized more and more that there was no difference at all. I still lived like a dog, but it was not as good as before, smuggling some Kobe beef or other things. After making a small profit from something like that, I would buy some wine and meat to reward myself. After I finished my work, I would go to have a great health care and have a good sleep. Thinking about it now, those days were really real. It is comfort and comfort. Why are you lamenting these things now? Subai was changing into patient clothes. Because I feel that after I leave tonight, I may never see you again. Subai. Dabai, if you really kneel down, and if I can continue to live in the future, if one day I get married, have a wife, and have children, I will take him to Xi'an to see the terracotta warriors and horses, pointing to the rows of terracotta warriors and horses in the terracotta warriors and horses pit, told my child, here is your uncle Dabai, who has been standing here through hardships. Fat man, do you want to hurt each other? No, 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 no. Subai rolled his eyes at the fat man and didn't bother to argue with him. Lying back on the bed, Subai put on his headphones and started listening to music. He was already a little weak, and after 2 more frights, he fell into a drowsy sleep. Fatty and the others said goodbye to Subai when they left at night, and Subai responded vaguely. Although this was not a separation between life and death, it was better than a separation between life and death, but there was no need to really create a feeling that Subai was about to die. At midnight, the door of Subai's ward was pushed open. Several nurses pushed a patient into the ward and placed the patient on the fat man's bed. If Subai could really sleep at this time, it would be an insult to his status as an audience. He woke up with a sense of vigilance and asked the nurse about the patient's condition. The nurse said that the patient was injured in a car accident and his family members were abroad and could not come immediately. However, the patient was out of danger and the surgery was successful, so he was temporarily arranged to come to this ward. Immediately, the nurse and doctor left, and another patient appeared in Subai's ward. The hospital is already a place rich in ghost stories. If Subai hadn't known that the horror broadcast had issued a real-life mission to him, he would have been worried that the horror broadcast would suddenly and inexplicably transport him into a story world with a hospital as the background. In the middle of the night, the patient in the bed next to him got up on his own. He walked a little slowly. His left arm was tied with a plaster, and his head was also wrapped with a bandage. But it didn't seem like the problem was serious. He stood up shakily, picked up and put it on the bed. There was a plastic basin on the bedside table, which contained toiletries and other items uniformly distributed by the hospital. However, his hands were a little unsteady, probably due to the sequelae of a mild concussion. The plastic basin tilted and something fell down. The patient turned his head and looked at Sudbai. From his bandaged face, Sudbai could see two faint pupils. Sudbai also looked at him with his eyes open at this time. The patient said in a hoarse voice, "Friend, can you pick up some soap for me?" Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 321. Sudbai just looked at his new patient with his eyes open, without saying anything or making a sound, just looking at him. The patient nodded, put down the plastic basin first, then slowly squatted down, picked up the soap with difficulty with his other hand, and then stood up staggeringly against the wall. After packing his things, he walked out of the ward with a plastic basin. He seemed to be a clean-loving guy with a misophobia. Sudbai took out his mobile phone and looked at it casually. In the ward after the lights were turned off, the background light of the mobile phone looked a bit bleak. After flipping through some news, Sudbai stretched gently. He had been sleeping for a long time before, but now he didn't feel sleepy at all. However, there was still some distance before dawn, and he was too lazy to do so. Leave the hospital and wander around. The monk and the others have already gone through a series of procedures for themselves. They can get some glucose in the hospital every day, and then have specialized nurses to take care of themselves. According to the monk and the others, even if they just lie in the hospital for half a month, they will be able to take care of themselves. It is well worth it to finish this realistic task safely. Sudbai's view was similar. There were no tangible benefits outside, only a feeble sense of oppression. He was too lazy to hang out, and he had to stay near Zien, so he could just lie down in the hospital. Half an hour later, footsteps were heard outside the corridor, and then the ward door was pushed open. The patient walked in, put the plastic basin on the ground, then walked back to his ward and slowly lay back down. What surprised Sudbai a little was that the other party didn't seem to care about his previous indifference. Seeing that he was still playing with his mobile phone, he took the initiative to speak. "The conditions of this hospital are really bad." "Yes," Sudbai responded. "What's your illness?" The other person was lying on the bed and turned his head to look at Sudbai. The curtain was not drawn between the two beds. Sudbai didn't answer, and continued to look at the phone with his head down. To be honest, Sudbai didn't dislike having someone talk to him in the ward. This would make him feel less lonely, but Sudbai didn't like communicating and chatting. It would be nice if the other person is willing to talk to himself all the time. Seeing that Sudbai didn't answer, the other party was silent for a while and said, "Looking at your face, you seem a little weak. Is there something wrong with your kidneys?" "Weak? Is there a problem with the kidneys? Why not just say kidney deficiency?" "Absolutely," Sudbai responded. "Young people should be more restrained," the other party said. "How old are you?" Sudbai responded. 45. The patient smiled to himself, "I have been dead for a long time." The scene fell into awkward silence again. The other party seemed to understand that Sudbai was not that interested in chatting, so he stopped trying to find a topic and chose a comfortable posture, as if he was ready to rest. Sudbai continued to play with his mobile phone and browsed the web casually. At this time, he used his mobile phone to log in to the audience forum. The founder of this forum should have obtained some information about powerful listeners from somewhere. People like Lizzie are those who are qualified to query a lot of information through the backend of the public account are now exposed and used by a few thoughtful people to establish this forum. There are a lot of people on the forum, and most of them are for the exchange of experiences and the exchange and purchase of items. Of course, this is a relatively low-level transaction method. The normal way is to use your own network to make contacts like a fat man. The forum here in Shaanxi is still very deserted. A while ago, many listeners from other places seemed to have learned about the troubles of listeners in Shaanxi through their own channels, so they came to post and send greetings, but they did not get any response from the listeners in Shaanxi, and I also feel a little chilly, so I don't dare to continue posting in the Shaanxi section. The audience in Shaanxi should not be dead, but those who experience it or are low-level listeners will not be specially invited by the staff of this forum, so this forum creates the feeling that all the listeners in Shaanxi region have died. Sudbai changed to another section and clicked on the Sichuan section. This section was quite lively. There was a post in it that had thousands of clicks. You must know that there are really very few people in this forum. Most of the posts where the number of clicks is only a few dozen, and it is very rare to exceed 100, because the traffic is too low. This post with more than 1000 clicks is indeed very conspicuous. After clicking in, Sudbai suddenly understood. This is a post by a female listener recording her life. Before she became a listener, she was a housewife with no children, and her married life was harmonious. After becoming a listener, she took the initiative to divorce her husband and left the house alone. Now she is working in a certain place in Sichuan. We provide education support in ethnic minority areas. Her posts are updated basically every day, and she posts some photos and life insights. This woman's post can't be said to be positive, but it's not decadent either. It gives people a very tasteful feeling and can inspire a lot of listeners to identify with it, so there are more comments in it. Sudbai lost track of time as he watched. He only heard the person on the bed next to him suddenly move and then sit up. It seemed that the painkillers had worn off and I started to feel pain, so I couldn't sleep. People who have never been injured can never understand the pain, especially serious injuries such as fractures. It's not yet dawn. The man sighed. He saw Sudbai playing with his mobile phone, so he was not worried about affecting Sudbai's rest. Sudbai was too lazy to answer the call and exited the forum, planning to find a movie to watch. In other words, if there is really no special danger, staying in this hospital for half a month can be considered a good relaxing experience. Eat, drink, and drink some glucose every day. Playing on your mobile phone, listening to music and watching movies. Once upon a time, this kind of life that was easily accessible has been so far away from you. Aren't you bored? The other person said again. I feel so bored. Sudbai shook his head, indicating that he didn't feel it. It's really boring. The other person's tone became bolder. Sudbai frowned and moved the phone away. The ward was still deserted. Although it was not very ventilated, it was definitely not in contact with men. Could it be that there was something wrong with his body that affected the blood supply to his heart? Sudbai hesitated whether to ring the bell and call the nurse on duty for the person in the next bed, but the other person's behavior at the next moment made Sudbai's face darken. Ah, no wonder, my heart was knocked out of place. As the patient spoke, he rubbed his heart with his hands so hard that he could even see the blood stains on the bandage. Is this guy's brain damaged? Blood began to seep out from the bandages on the man's body, staining the area red. At the same time, the other person's breathing became heavier and heavier. It was really the car accident that damaged his brain. The hospital's examination probably wasn't very careful, and they obviously underestimated the subsequent effects of the concussion. However, just as the other person was scratching his chest, the bandage originally wrapped around his wrist slowly fell off, and Sudbai saw that the guy was wearing something on his wrist. Xiaomi bracelet? This was the first thought that came to Sudbai's mind, because judging from the shape, it really looked like the popular electronic bracelet. Nowadays, many young people and even middle-aged people like to wear it. It can record a lot of their information in real time and view it on their mobile phones. However, why did Sudbai feel something was wrong when looking at this bracelet? Which company's bracelets are made like this? And since this guy was in a car accident and went to the hospital, why did the doctors and nurses leave this bracelet on the patient during the previous operation? At this time, the patient got out of bed and stumbled to Sudbai's bedside. It's really hard for me to breathe. I feel so thirsty. A man with a bandage on his face is talking to you like this. In the hospital ward with the lights turned off, you can imagine how terrifying the scene is, but Subai just turned his face slightly and focused his attention again. On your own mobile phone. There's a hot water bottle over there. Pour some water yourself. My hands are bad, friend, please come and get me a glass of water, the other party begged, and the movable hand subconsciously grabbed Subai's shoulder and shook it gently. Subai turned his head, and the background light of the mobile phone shone on the other person's arm, allowing Subai to see the bracelet more clearly, and at the same time, he could also see the words on the bracelet clearly. This man just looked at Subai with his eyes. The distance between their faces was only 1 decimeter, and the ward fell into silence. It was Subai who broke the silence. Subai calmly uttered 2 words, "No time." "But I'm really thirsty," the patient begged. "Go out and find the nurse. There is a water dispenser in the duty room and there is cold water." Subai shook his head helplessly. "The water in the thermos is too hot." "Yes, thank you, friend." The patient stood up with difficulty and staggered out of the ward. Subai's pupils narrowed slightly. Why couldn't he detect any special aura before? All of this seemed like returning to Lao Fang's house, where he had no sense of those ghosts at all. My patient in the next bed was wearing an electronic bracelet on his wrist, not a Xiaomi bracelet or something like that, but a corpse ring. There is a blue corpse ring with a label on it that reads: Name of the deceased. Time of death. Cause of death. This is a corpse ring made by the hospital morgue staff to facilitate the management of corpses. This kind of thing only appears on the wrists of corpses. Subai reached out and pressed the bedside bell. About half a minute later, a nurse opened the ward door and walked in. "Patient in bed number 1, what's wrong? What's wrong?" Subai calmly pointed to the empty bed next to him. "There is something wrong with the patient in this bed, and there is something on his wrist." Subai stopped here. Because he saw. The nurse who came in for rounds also wore a blue bracelet on her wrist that was exactly the same as the previous patient's, a corpse bracelet. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Disyao. Chapter 322. It's okay, I just had a nightmare. Subai shook his head, indicating that he was okay. At this time, anything he said would cause trouble, so he might as well not say anything at all, and he didn't want to hide it, so he just peeled off this page. The nurse stood there motionless, looking at Subai with a touch of curiosity and exploration. However, the corpse ring on her wrist was so dazzling to Subai. The soft eyes had a sinister feeling. After a while, the nurse took the initiative and walked towards Subai. Subai closed his eyes and folded his hands on his chest, very calmly. When the nurse stood at the head of Subai's bed, Subai could keenly sense a cold breath, as if a cooling air conditioning fan was blowing on him. At this time, Subai suddenly thought of Jamei, the one who was there. The female experiencer who faked corpses in the funeral home contracted her zombie constitution from her. No matter what he was thinking, Subai remained silent, as if he had fallen into a deep sleep. The nurse stood beside Subai for a full quarter of an hour, and finally turned around and left the ward quietly. The ward door was pushed shut from the outside with a crisp sound, but Subai still didn't open his eyes and maintained his sleeping position steadily. About a minute later, the nurse's face appeared again at the window of the ward door. She used the light in the corridor to stare into the ward, staring at Subai, and remained motionless for another 2 minutes. When she saw Subai's breathing was very steady and he was still asleep. Only then did the nurse really turn around and leave. At this time, Subai slowly opened his eyes. For a moment, Subai suddenly felt a little ridiculous. The monk and the others left in the evening, but the hospital started to be haunted in the middle of the night. He really didn't know what to say. In today's environment, in this situation, especially in the atmosphere in Xi'an that is very unfriendly to the audience, Subai did not want to cause too much trouble, so at this time, he chose to pretend to be deaf, pretend to be blind, pretend to be I don't know what to do and pretend I haven't discovered anything. Those dirty things, you can continue to make trouble, just don't bother me. After lying on the hospital bed for a while, a glimmer of morning light appeared over the window sill. Sky. It's about to light up. Work at sunrise and rest at sunset. This ancient law of life has become less adhered to by people with the advancement of science and technology. Most young people have long since stopped treating night as a sign of rest. However, for a city, for a hospital, dawn means excitement. There were family members of patients coming and going, doctors and nurses coming and going, and the popularity suddenly increased. The patient in the next bed went out to ask the nurse for water in the middle of the night, but he didn't come back or show up until the morning. A nurse came over and asked if he wanted breakfast. Subai ordered one. After it was delivered, he ate breakfast quietly, changed into a patient uniform and walked out. He had been lying in bed all night, and he had to go out for a walk. Behind the ward building is a green area. Subai was pushed into the pool by a bloody corpse yesterday. The sun was just right at this time, and the warm sunshine shone down, as if it could dispel the haze in people's hearts. Subai was sitting against the rockery. The water in the pool was not very clear, but there were some goldfish swimming around. The surrounding scenery was a bit cramped because of the surrounding ward buildings, and the viewing angle was not very wide. But when he thought that this was a hospital, being able to have a quiet green space in the hospital without the smell of disinfectant is enough for people to feel satisfied. I don't know what to do, I don't know how to do it. It seems that all I have left in the mission time is dawdling, but being able to dawdle is also a blessing and luck. Subai doesn't have to worry about finding trouble even if he has nothing to do. Energetic. The ghosts in this hospital seem to be the only thing that could bring pleasure to Subai. At this thought, Subai couldn't help but smile a little. What are you laughing at? A woman in a white coat came over, took out a cigarette from her pocket, and lit it eagerly. This woman was wearing black stockings, a mole at the corner of her mouth, and a touch of peach color between her eyebrows. Yu is obviously a woman with strong needs in that area, but she can never get them effectively met. To describe it in more popular terms, is also a doctor. This kind of woman is very popular and sought after outside. It should be a female doctor who skipped work and secretly smoked a cigarette. Subai ignored her and just chose a comfortable position to lie down against the rockery. Which ward are you from? It's windy outside, so don't lie down outside. The female doctor blew out a smoke ring and continued, the quality of this patient's clothes is extremely poor, and they are not kept warm. I know, lie down for a while, Subai said. It's up to you. The female doctor finished smoking a cigarette. She seemed to feel comfortable and relaxed. Then she stood there and stamped her feet. She took out another cigarette and lit it. She probably planned to take advantage of this time and opportunity to get rid of her addiction. Let's talk after you've given enough. The female doctor finished her second cigarette and left. Subai thought that no one would disturb her peace again, but Subai was still wrong. The population density of this hospital is still very scary. This is a quiet place to bask in the sun. It was impossible that only Subai could see it. Not long after the female doctor left, a nurse came over pushing an old man in a wheelchair. The old man's hair has fallen out, and from the collar of his clothes, you can see many black circles on his chest. From here, it can be seen that the old man should be a cancer patient, and his time is running out. It's good to be young. The old man was pushed to the edge of the pond by the nurse and stopped. He turned his head and looked at Subai, who was lying on the rockery to rest in the sun. A hint of envy flashed in his eyes. Obviously, the more people are about to lose something, the more precious they find it. Subai opened his eyes and looked at the old man and the nurse behind him. It seemed that something happened last night, so Subai specifically looked at their wrists. There were no corpse rings. It's windy outside, we'd better go back early, the nurse reminded the old man. If I stay a little longer, I won't be able to see much sunshine. The old man seemed a little obsessed, and the sunlight reflected on his face also made him look a little greedy. This scene also fell into Subai's eyes. In Subai's view, it seemed a bit pretentious. Also, he had experienced life and death countless times, so he had long been accustomed to some things. Numb. The old man suddenly clutched his chest, his expression looked a little painful, and then his body trembled and he rolled over from the wheelchair. The nurse was a little panicked and wanted to help the old man back to the wheelchair, but although the old man was not alive, his body was still weak. She was quite big, and the little nurse didn't have enough strength to pull her up at all. She was dragged to the ground by the old man who was struggling in pain. Subai sighed, stood up, and left without even looking at the two people lying on the ground. Back in the ward, the bed next door was still empty, but the quilt on the bed was obviously used by someone who lay down on it last night. This is not an hallucination, and it cannot be a hallucination. If it is someone else, it may really be a delusion. Or maybe I had read some hospital ghost stories before and got touched by it one night alone in the hospital, but for an audience of Subai's level, it was impossible to make such a mistake. In the drawer of the bedside table were 2 cigarettes and a lighter that the fat man left for himself before leaving. Of course, there were also 2 mobile phones. One of Subai's mobile phones had been crushed by a blood corpse before, and then the monk helped Subai buy another one. There are several mobile phones here. After all, it is always very inconvenient for a listener to not have a mobile phone around. Subai opened a pack of cigarettes, took one out and bit it in his mouth. Just when Subai was about to light it, the ward door was pushed open. A cleaner came in with a bucket and mop. He was surprised to see Subai sitting on the hospital bed, and then complained, "Don't smoke here, this is a hospital." Subai smiled, then lit up and lay on the bed, puffing away the smoke by himself. The cleaner was also so angry that he actually lost his temper and went out with a bucket and mop. It seemed that he was not willing to help Subai clean the house. He was really honest. Lying on the hospital bed and smoking a cigarette, Subai walked down. He suddenly remembered one thing, that is, he remembered that the fat man had said that he hired a caregiver for him, but it had been a whole day. Where was the caregiver? After walking out of his ward, Subai turned around and faced the service desk over there. There are several nurses busy at the service desk. There is also a computer specially used to connect to the surveillance. It can be regarded as an extension. The place where the entire hospital's camera surveillance is summarized should be in the security department. After passing the service desk, there were several temporary doctor offices. Subai saw the female doctor in black stockings. She was examining a patient lying on the bed. Because there was a curtain between them, Subai walked in. She didn't notice it either. When he walked to the female doctor's desk, there were several orders placed in a mess. Then, Subai's eyes were attracted by the 2 names. One was Subai and the other was Zhang Bei. These are 2 early discharge declarations, with Zhang Bei's name and Subai's name signed there. When were you discharged from the hospital? Subai pursed her lips and turned towards the service desk. It seemed that something happened in a ward. Several nurses at the service desk ran to help. For a while, the service desk was empty. Subai stood in front of the surveillance computer, recalling in his mind the time when Fatty and the others said goodbye to him last night, and then clicked on the surveillance record to start playback. After adjusting the time several times, Subai finally saw the scene he wanted to see, but this scene brought more consternation to Subai. In the monitoring screen, 4 people walked past the service desk and went to the elevator. There is a fat man. There is Gyatso. There is a monk. He even has himself. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 323. Subai took a few deep breaths. After confirming that he had read correctly, he subconsciously took a few steps back. At this time, a nurse came over and saw Subai standing in the service station. He asked with some confusion. "Hello, what's the matter?" "Pour me a glass of water," Subai said. Okay, the nurse seemed to encounter this situation often, so she immediately poured Subai a glass of water from a disposable plastic cup. Perhaps, this is also because although this hospital is large, its basic service facilities are relatively poor. On the first floor, there are only water dispensers in the service station and office. Patients in other wards have to be family members or themselves, who have to get the water dispensed by the hospital in person. Thermos to get water. Taking the paper cup and drinking down the slightly cold water in it, Subai reached out and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Is there anything else?" the nurse asked again when she saw Subai still standing here after drinking water. "I want to see how much money I have here," Subai pointed at himself and asked. "Generally speaking, when you are hospitalized, you will pay a deposit, etc., and you will be refunded or reimbursed. Since the surveillance camera shows that you have left the hospital and completed the discharge procedures, can you still stay in that ward?" Name. The nurse sat down in front of the computer to help Subai look it up. Subai hesitated for a moment, but still said the name, Su from Jiangsu, White from Bai. After the nurse entered the name, she smiled and said, "You still have a deposit of more than 8,000 in your card." For a moment, Subai felt his head hurt. Looking at the nurse's face, it also became a little distorted. He subconsciously supported the table with one hand and slowly squatted down. Sir, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you?" Doctor, there is something wrong with a patient here. Please come to the service station quickly." This was the last sound that Subai heard in a trance, and then he felt a little confused and unconscious. About half a day later, it was dark outside the window. Subai opened his eyes slightly and found that he was lying on the original hospital bed, still receiving infusion, and there was still a dull pain in his head. Subconsciously sitting up, his body suddenly felt very empty. Subai stretched out his palm and clenched it slightly, but he could no longer feel the power. To be more precise, it was his own power. It is constantly being weakened. The palm of the hand keeps shrinking, but keeps recovering. There is no way to switch out of the zombie state now. Own. Are you constantly changing into an ordinary person? A huge panic suddenly enveloped his heart, and the picture he saw on the surveillance camera immediately appeared in Subai's mind. In the picture, he had been discharged from the hospital with Fatty and the others. Does that mean that the real him, it is true that he has been discharged from the hospital? The one who remains is just a spiritually imprinted existence, similar to a kind of puppet? Pulling out his own needle, Subai put his hands on his face. Is the current self actually fake? You are not really yourself at all? Do you just think that you are the real yourself? For a time, many thoughts kept swirling in Subai's mind, making his mood irritated little by little. No matter who encounters this kind of thing, the reaction is probably the same. At this time, the ward door was pushed open. Subai was stunned for a moment, then raised his head and looked. It was not the nurse who estimated the time to pull out the needle, but the patient with the bandage on his face. The patient looked at Subai with his dark eyes, then grinned and smiled. "Are you awake?" For a moment, a chilling feeling rose from the bottom of Subai's heart. Before, Subai could face this patient calmly, and even saw the corpse ring on his wrist without panicking at all. The fundamental reason was that Subai was confident that his own strength could easily cope with all the miscellaneous things in front of him. But when Subai found that his power was constantly weakening, it meant that the biggest support in his heart was gone. "Hey, something's wrong with you today." Is your condition getting worse? The patient walked up to Subai. He still walked slowly and with a slight limp. When he kept getting closer to Subai, Subai subconsciously began to lean behind the bed. The patient came to Subai anyway, looking at Subai with a bandaged face, with a smile. This smile was very strange, and it seemed that there was a hint of ridicule hidden in it. It means like, you also have today, weren't you very calm yesterday? Subai's hands began to tremble uncontrollably. The patient stretched out his hand, and the hand with the corpse ring on the wrist was slowly placed on Subai's forehead. It's a bit hot. Do you have a fever? Subai's body began to tremble uncontrollably. When you suddenly realize that you have become an ordinary person, the capital you had before, everything you had before, and the many confidences you had before are all gone in an instant. For this the fear of such a thing instantly fills your heart, filling every part and every detail of your body. Moreover, this fear caused by the weakening of strength is already very deep, plus this in this environment, facing such a person and thing makes this fear increase tremendously. At this time, a nurse walked in. She was holding a plate in her hand, with things like tape and cotton swabs on it. She should be here to remove Subai's needle. The nurse also had a blue corpse on her wrist. Huan, when she walked in, the temperature in the ward dropped again. Why are you so naughty? The nurse came over step by step. How could you pull out the needle before I came? The nurse walked up to Subai, without looking at the patient who was also standing on the other side of Subai's bed. Instead, she reached out and grabbed Subai's wrist. Cold. So cold. It's as cold as in a refrigerator. Subai's body trembled subconsciously. If you don't behave, you have to insert the needle again and finish the infusion. As she spoke, the nurse picked up the needle without any expression on her face, and even showed an extremely unnatural tinge of iron blue. No, do not want. Subai subconsciously retracted his hand, his body began to struggle, and he began to curl up his legs. No, don't come near me, don't come near me. You are sick. You must listen to the nurse. The patient reached out to grab Subai to prevent Subai from struggling. His hand got stuck on Subai's shoulder and pressed Subai on the bed. The nurse started to insert the needle into the back of Subai's hand, and felt a sharp pain. Yeah, it didn't penetrate the blood vessels. The nurse pulled out the needle again. As he pulled it out, Subai's face began to drip with sweat, and his breathing began to become rapid. Again. Yeah, it didn't penetrate the blood vessels. Don't worry, it won't happen next time. Ah, it's still wrong. Come again. Subai's eyes began to turn white, and his entire spirit had reached the breaking point under this torture. The patient continued to hold Subai with his hands, but when he found that Subai's struggle began to become weaker and weaker, his strength also became smaller. However, at this moment, Subai's face flushed. Subai's eyes suddenly regained focus. There was a twisted and fierce look on his face. You. Subai put his foot on the patient's chest, kicked him back and fell to the ground. At the same time, Subai grabbed the nurse's hand, snatched the needle from the nurse's hand, and grabbed it with the other hand. He grabbed the nurse's neck and stabbed the needle into the nurse's eye. Puff. The smelly black liquid splashed from the nurse's eyes. You are a patient, you have to listen to the nurse. The needle is inserted into your hand for infusion. How could you insert it into my eye, good boy? The patient and the nurse seemed not to notice Subai's counterattack at all, but moved closer to Subai again. The tide of fear seemed to be sweeping over me again. Subai suddenly laughed, as if he was crazy. He thought of many pictures in his mind, what he had seen before, and what he saw now. Patients with bandages, patients with body rings. The power I lost. The image of myself leaving in the surveillance screen. Own discharge record. When all the details and everything, are pushing oneself into the abyss of fear. There must be something wrong here. Because. Too deliberate. Too deliberate means too fake. Every detail is designed, every character that appears, every fear factor is arranged, just waiting for you to follow this road step by step, step on it. Then. Fall down. You want to scare me to pieces, come on, Subai murmured to himself, and the scene in the painting that Ji Xiang showed to him began to appear in his mind. The rack. Burn. Knights Templar. Cardinal. Pope. God. When Subai began to recall and imagine that scene, a fire suddenly started next to his bed, and at the same time, a sound of poetry reciting sounded like it came from the depths of the Holy See. The nurse's face began to distort and change, and began to turn into a Templar lying on the ground. The bandaged patient began to transform into a cardinal. The whole ward scene seemed to have turned into a piece of shredded paper at this time, and began to become pitted and fragmented. Wow! Finally! Like the sound of breaking glass. Subai rolled off the bed, but he landed not on the cold floor tiles, but on a piece of grass. He didn't fall off the bed, but fell off the back of the rockery he was lying on. In front of Subai, the female doctor who was smoking her second cigarette let out a muffled groan. The second cigarette burned for a long time and finally fell to the ground. At the same time, her face was full of disbelief. 2 lines of blood and tears flowed from the female doctor's pupils. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 324. Wiping the green grass on his palms and patting the dirt on his trousers, Subai slowly stood up. The sunshine and the fresh air suddenly became so fascinating. Sometimes people are so mean and don't know how to cherish it when they have it, but after experiencing the feeling of loss, they will miss it very much in an instant. The blood flowing out of the female doctor's eyes stained her white coat, making her look a little embarrassed. She covered her face with both hands, and the blood was still lingering, but she still slowly raised her head. Blood-red eyes stared at Subai. I don't know you. When Subai said this, there was obvious murderous intent in his body. He didn't know her, but she almost killed him. The female doctor didn't answer, but she looked at Subai as if she were looking at a person with deep hatred. It seemed that the words didn't make sense, and there was no need to make sense. If someone wanted to die by himself, then Subai couldn't let him live in peace and contentment. Because the blood corpse had absorbed a lot of vitality from his body before, he was a little weak, but the cultivation in the past 2 days could be regarded as making up for it. As Subai took the initiative to walk towards the female doctor, his body began to undergo obvious changes. His fangs appeared, his body began to become tense, and a faint red color began to appear on his skin, giving people an extraordinarily strange feeling. In his memory, Subai rarely switched to the vampire state to fight, because the vampire state had suffered a lot in the past, but after experiencing the scene in the scroll, Subai found that he seemed to use the bloodline of the vampire more. Understand? The female doctor has not recovered from the previous trauma, and her bloody eyes are still so scary, but she can still catch Subai's movement towards her. Her hair immediately spreads out, and there are waves on the pond. The waves are like a mirror melding, containing endless mysteries and changes. Subai approached the female doctor and struck with one hand. The sharp nails made a sound of breaking through the air. However, what Subai's nails scratched was just a phantom. The figure of the female doctor was in the pond. Emerge. Subai's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew clearly that the female doctor's strengthening route should be similar to illusion. She could easily deceive his senses, and the effect was equivalent to the old Fang family's formation. However, what he was seeing now was position. It can be regarded as a mobile formation. If the fat man and the monk were still here, dealing with this kind of enhanced illusion should be regarded as specialization in the arts. However, for Subai, it would be much more troublesome because of the mismatch of majors. Sudbai closed his eyes and squatted down slightly. He was trying his best to use his sixth sense to find traces of the other party. Although the effect was very poor, on the surface, it looked really bluffing, quite a "I've seen it all" feeling. In the pond, the female doctor crossed her hands and her body began to turn into pieces of water mist. She was planning to leave. Similarly, the most unexpected attack on Sudbai at the beginning failed, and instead caused her own eyes to be injured. Now, it is a bit fanciful to drag Sudbai into his carefully designed illusion. Corresponding to Sudbai, she had the ability to hide herself, but she was unable to kill Sudbai when Sudbai was awake. The water mist began to float away from the water, and it seemed that he was planning to escape directly. Just when the mist was about to float out of the water, the corners of Sudbai's eyes suddenly twitched, and he let out a sharp roar. His whole body turned into a blood mist, spreading like a hungry tiger descending the mountain. On the surface of the pond, you can clearly see a piece of blood mist and a piece of water mist entangled together. The blood mist carries a fierce and hysterical atmosphere, while the water mist is completely at a disadvantage from the beginning. This guy made himself feel the feeling of fear, and made himself feel the feeling of helplessness. For Sudbai, this female doctor was tantamount to exposing his privacy. How could he not become angry? The blood mist began to absorb the life breath from the water mist. Anyway, Sudbai had absorbed a lot of life energy from the blood corpses in the Terracotta Warriors and Horses Museum before, so he just took this opportunity to make up for it. Soon, the water mist could no longer hold up, and the illusion disappeared. The female doctor fell into the pond with a pale face. The blood mist instantly condensed into Sudbai's figure. Sudbai clasped the female doctor's neck with one hand, jumped out of the water and landed behind the rockery on one side. 5 nails had already pierced into the female doctor's neck without killing anyone, but as long as the female doctor dared to move again, Sudbai would break her neck in an instant. The female doctor was still sane, because Sudbai did not absorb her into a human being, but gave her a breath. Although Sudbai wanted to kill her now, Sudbai wanted to know why she would take action against him. Sudbai was sure that he had never seen this female doctor before, and there was no interaction between the two. "Why do you attack me?" Sudbai's voice was a little hoarse. When he spoke, he stuck out his tongue and licked his lips. There was anger in his expression, but also the satisfaction after having just sucked in the life force. "You have a connection with it, you know it?" The female doctor seemed to have difficulty speaking because her neck was clamped by Sudbai's nails, but Sudbai did not give her more freedom, because Sudbai had to ensure that her limbs were in deep contact with the other person, so that she no longer had to worry about the other person possibly coming back again. The illusion method that appeared, after all, Sudbai still had the confidence to use his wrist to break her neck before the other party used illusions to confuse him again. "Fart," Sudbai replied. There was a look of hatred on the female doctor's face. "It didn't kill you, I can see clearly." Sudbai frowned slightly. Apparently, the female doctor was talking about the incident where Blood Corpse used his cell phone to listen to auspicious cries in the bathroom. After that, Blood Corpse did not kill him, but just pushed himself out of the toilet wall to let himself go. Fell into the pond. "How do I know why it didn't kill me, but I really have no connection with it," Sudbai said. "You have decided to kill me. If you were not guilty, you would not talk nonsense to a person who is about to be killed by you." Blood was constantly overflowing from the corners of the female doctor's mouth. Obviously, her physical condition was not very good. First, her illusion was broken by Sudbai using a deeper mental picture, and she also suffered serious backlash. Then she was captured by Sudbai while escaping, and she forcibly absorbed most of the vitality. Now, she is still alive only because of the audience's extraordinary physique. If it were an ordinary person, even if she had 3 lives, he would have died a long time ago. Sudbai was silent, because he felt that the female doctor's words made sense. He had actually guessed the identity of the bloody corpse in his heart. As for whether he was completely sure, Subai didn't know, but many details had already made this bloody corpse. He tried to get closer to that person's identity, but he was worried about the reason for the horror broadcast, so he couldn't tell the identity of the bloody corpse. He didn't even reveal a word to the fat monk Subai. Subai's plan in his mind was actually very simple, that is, to get this matter out of the way. This matter had nothing to do with him. The purpose of the bloody corpse and the tragic death of the entire audience in Shaanxi had nothing to do with him. This matter had nothing to do with him. I don't want to touch the muddy water, nor do I want to get involved in the slightest. You mean, apart from you, are there other listeners here? This is what Subai is most concerned about. Obviously, since the terrorist broadcast has given him real-life tasks, he should also send them to others. As for what kind of people to choose, and what the standards and intentions of the terrorist broadcast are, Subai has no idea. Clear. A smile appeared on the corner of the female doctor's mouth. Of course I'm not the only one, but don't worry, they already know your identity and your whereabouts. I'm just the first one to take action. There will be others behind me. Subai took a deep breath. Why don't you go find trouble with the blood corpse and come to me specifically? There was a flush on the female doctor's face, as if she was having a flashback, and she let out a low growl like a beast, almost angrily. That thing is so terrifying, who dares to face it? Yes, who dares to face it? The monk and the fat man were all heroes. They had worked together to kill Lao Fang before, but when this happened, they just patted their butts and walked away because the bloody corpse was too powerful. It was horrifying, so horrifying that they themselves clearly realized that they were powerless, so they simply left. Obviously, Subai could understand the meaning of the female doctor's angry roar. Sighing, Subai released his hand from the female doctor's neck, leaving 5 dark grooves on her neck, which were the marks left by fingernails. Whether you believe it or not, I really have nothing to do with it. You go away. I won't kill you. It is our misfortune to be assigned to this damn real task. If we continue to kill each other because of some bloody things, really very boring. The female doctor was a little surprised and looked at Subai. You really don't want to kill me? Get out of here, be careful I change my mind, Subai urged. The female doctor's eyes changed when she looked at Subai. Do you really have nothing to do with it? Can you please get out? The female doctor pursed her lips and stood up staggeringly. However, when she was about to walk away, a hand penetrated directly from her back, crushing her heart and completely losing her life to her body that was already on the verge of collapse. Subai's head appeared on the female doctor's shoulder, his face was close to the female doctor's face, and he said very gently and softly. It was going too slowly, so I changed my mind. You. The female doctor didn't say the last word, and completely lost all her vitality. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Terror Broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 325. How could it be possible to let her go? Did she ever think about letting me go when she almost drove herself crazy and died in the illusion before? Even if he didn't know the name of the female doctor, even if he knew that there might be other listeners nearby, no matter how many people there were, in Subai's heart, this woman had already been sentenced to death. This is just a trick. On the one hand, it is to play with the opponent's mentality, so that the opponent will have that kind of hope when he is about to die, and then kill it abruptly. This is just like masturbating. Before finally ejaculating, you have to masturbate back and forth in different ways to make your pleasure last longer. Subai's hands were caressing the female doctor's body, but he didn't find any magic weapon or anything like that, not even a mobile phone or wallet. It was estimated that this woman was a female doctor in disguise, and she should have put all her previous things there. Another place. However, from a pocket of his white coat, Subai took out a pocket watch. A not very exquisite pocket watch, not that kind of luxury watch series. It is almost equivalent to a souvenir worth dozens of dollars on the street. When you open the pocket watch, there is a photo embedded in the cover. It is this female doctor. She looks younger than she is now. Not as mature as she is now. She was still a little green at that time. It seems that she should be at least a year ago in the photo. For the audience, 1 year is enough to change a lot. In the photo, in addition to the woman, there is also a cat. The cat was held in the arms of the woman and the photo was taken. The cat had a cold attitude, as if it was held by you and the photo was taken for you. Same face. A cat, a black cat. Auspicious. Sudbai's lips were a little dry at this moment. The person she had just killed was actually related to Jixiang. So according to this idea, she was also related to the person she guessed. The people Terror Broadcasting selected to perform the real-life mission this time could not be randomly selected. They should have selected people who had certain similarities. After understanding this, Subai finally felt a little enlightened. It seemed that the horror broadcast was really testing and confirming through these methods. Why not just stop broadcasting for a while and make rectifications? Do we have to go through such a curve to save the country? Subai murmured to himself. Subai couldn't figure out the specific plan of the terrorist broadcast and didn't bother to guess. However, he picked up the female doctor's body and walked into the pond. There were many people under the pond. Among the stones and waste, Subai found a gap and stuck the body inside, then surfaced it. There were still some blood stains on the lawn, and Subai also covered it up. She was originally a fake identity and an audience, so her death should not cause too many real-world ripples. Perhaps it was because the atmosphere in Xi'an was too unfriendly to the audience, so Subai seemed more cautious than before when doing things. As for what the female doctor said before, there would be other audiences coming to see her. Subai is not very worried about this matter. On the one hand, no one has any exact contact information or identity. No one knows who else has accepted this task, so the female doctor's words are true or false. Subject to debate. On the other hand, even if this female doctor has her own network of contacts and can spread the news about Subai, if the soldiers come to cover it up, Xi'an is now the tomb of the audience, and the bloody corpse is also elusive. Even if you have to hold on to the dragon when it comes here. Everyone is pretending to be grandson, who is afraid of whom? Subai returned to the ward. He did not plan to stay in the hospital any longer. When the crisis was clearly still hanging over him, it was not a wise choice to continue pretending to be an ostrich and bury his head in the sand pit to enjoy the sunshine in the hospital. My clothes are dirty and wet. I want to change into another set of clothes before leaving. In the double ward, the bed next door was still messy. Subai, who had changed his clothes, stood beside his bed, feeling a little lost in thought. If the female doctor attacked herself while she was lying on the rockery for a nap, then the scene last night, where the patient and nurse wearing corpse rings were not actually the product of an illusion, but a reality. Although Subai himself is not good at this kind of magic, he knows a little bit about it. This kind of magic relies more on fabricating and changing the other party's memory to create a more immersive picture and then achieve a more realistic effect. It has the effect of destroying the opponent's spiritual pillar. This means that the female doctor's illusion of mental attack on her was based on her recent memory. Walking to the bed next door, Subai lifted the quilt off the bed, but there was nothing inside. Subai remembered that the patient went to the service station to look for water. In fact, there is one place where he should be able to find him, and that is the morgue of the hospital, but Subai is not that boring. Putting the quilt back, Subai was about to leave. However, it seemed that the wind caused by the falling quilt blew up a piece of paper. The piece of paper was blue, very similar to the color of the quilt cover of the hospital bed. Before it was very inconspicuous on the bed, but it was blown out by Sudbai's action of opening and closing the quilt. Picking up this piece of paper, Sudbai found that there were no words on it, only a portrait, a person with a few strokes and a cat's face with a few strokes. Cat again? Sudbai found that he was now allergic to cats, but what did this cat mean? Could it be said that it is auspicious again? A black cat who usually basks in the sun and looks at paintings with children suddenly looks so camera-like, which makes Sudbai a little unexpected. But what does this piece of paper mean? Was it left by the ghost in this hospital, or by the bloody corpse? At this time, Sudbai suddenly thought of a possibility. When did the dirty things in the hospital become active? When did you first meet the patient in the next bed and the nurse? It was after the afternoon when the bloody corpse came to the bathroom of this hospital and blew up his cell phone. Could it be said that the bloody corpse now lying in the morgue of this hospital was attracted by the breath of the bloody corpse, so the dirty things in this hospital became active? However, instead of staying in the Terracotta Warriors and Horses Museum and continuing to admire its beauty, what was the bloody corpse doing in the hospital morgue? Could it be that he got tired of living in the first emperor's mausoleum in the Shenzai compound, so he wanted to escape the heat in the morgue for a change? I don't know why, but when I thought of this, Sudbai, who had not planned to go to the morgue, suddenly felt a little more impulsive. The bloody corpse didn't kill me that day and made me think that that person had come back. Why did it continue to stay in this hospital? Sudbai's first reaction was to wait for himself, but then he thought about it and it seemed a bit too pretentious. If he really waited for himself deliberately, then what could not be communicated or explained in the toilet that day? Or perhaps, it is waiting for another person in this audience that it needs to wait for. Sudbai didn't feel that he was not that person. He was not that naive, and the world would not completely revolve around him. However, if it was really him, he thought that it was him and he wanted to leave this house. Before going to the hospital, I always feel a little bad if I don't go and take a look. After walking out of the ward, Sudbai went directly to the elevator and pressed the down button. On the way, he also took a bottle of Centennial Mountain from the service station. After the elevator reached the bottom floor, Sudbai took the stairs again. This floor seemed a little empty. Obviously there were not many people coming and going. Going deeper, the words mortuary over there, even in the most common terms, appeared. The font written in it also makes people feel a little subconsciously numb. Sudbai had seen all kinds of big scenes before, but for some unknown reason recently, he suddenly became more sensitive to such ghostly things than before. Perhaps it was also because of the oppression that the blood corpse had brought to him before. It's probably because the force is too great. The morgue was locked. Sudbai scratched the glass on the door with his nails, then put his hand in and opened the door. There is a freezer inside, and most of the corpses are put in the freezer, but some corpses are also placed on stretchers. For a large hospital, there must be many corpses of unknown origin or inconvenient to handle. Sudbai lifted up the white cloth on the first stretcher car in front of him, and a familiar face appeared in front of Sudbai. He was wrapped in bandages and had a blue corpse ring on his wrist. I brought you some water. Sudbai opened the bottle cap of Beijuishan and poured the mineral water into the corpse's mouth. What was strange was that the corpse's mouth did not overflow with the influx of mineral water, as if it was really being squeezed. It seemed like he drank it. Sudbai smiled, placed the remaining half bottle of mineral water next to the arm of the corpse on the stretcher, and then covered it with a white cloth. Walking further in, passing 4 or 5 stretcher trucks, Sudbai stopped in front of the stretcher truck in the deepest part. He took a deep breath and gathered up his courage. Since it was back, he didn't have to be afraid anymore. Although he didn't have much interaction with it before, since it had never hurt him before, it had never hurt him before. Now, Probably not, right? Perhaps, this feeling is so innocent and wonderful, but this is Sudbai's character. When he is close to this corpse, Sudbai's adrenaline begins to secrete at a faster pace. That kind of pleasure, that kind of excitement, is constantly filled with Sudbai's scalp. Sudbai got a great excitement from it. I don't know what happened to you, and I don't know what your situation is now. Now that you're back, you can tell me if there's anything I can do to help you. After Sudbai finished speaking, he stretched out his hand to lift the white cloth, but this time Sudbai lifted it not on his head, but on his lower body. He must have made a mistake because he was too nervous. There was indeed that bloody corpse lying inside. However, Sudbai's eyes suddenly fell on the bloody corpse's crotch. The bloody chicken was standing there stiffly. Sudbai's hand trembled immediately. Is the bloody corpse male? Not Lychee. In an instant, a great fear filled the entire morgue. Terror broadcast. Author, Chunji Dixiaolong. Chapter 326. The bloody corpse was still lying on the stretcher without moving. There was not even a vent in the morgue, but the temperature was naturally very low. However, beads of sweat began to appear on Sudbai's skin. It's a cold sweat. The bloody corpse is not her. This was beyond Sudbai's expectation. So, who is the bloody corpse? Sudbai turned around and planned to leave. His previous guesses had completely different results from reality. This also made Sudbai's previous confidence in his safety extremely doubtful. Since the blood corpse was not a Lychee, then the blood corpse was in the bathroom. The attitude and condescension towards oneself in the Terracotta Warriors and Horses Museum is somewhat unreasonable. In this world, there is no love for no reason and no hatred for no reason. The other person should have their own reasons for not killing him 2 or 3 times. It would be really irrational for him to go forward and get involved at this time. Sudbai slowly backed away until he exited the morgue door. Sudbai's heart was still in his chest. After he went up the stairs and walked out of the hospital door, he let out a long sigh of relief. The bloody corpse once again let him go. No, the bloody corpse not only gave up on itself, but also gave up on the female doctor. The female doctor witnessed the blood corpse pushing itself from the toilet into the pond, but Sudbai did not believe that the female doctor's illusions could compare to the blood corpse. Sudbai had witnessed the blood corpse's work in the Terracotta Warriors and Horses Museum with his own eyes. This means that the blood corpse at that time must have known about the existence of the female doctor, but while the blood corpse spared itself, it also spared the female doctor. Sudbai knew clearly that he and the female doctor were specially selected listeners of the horror broadcast. They were by no means the strongest among the current listeners, but they were sent here because they were both related to auspiciousness. Perhaps, when the horror broadcast tested the identity of the blood corpse, it also made the blood corpse restrain itself, and it was no longer as unscrupulous as it was before when it massacred all the high-end listeners in Shaanxi to create Jingguan. This is a very high-level game. Sudbai knows that he, including the female doctor who was killed by him before, is just a pawn in this game, and it is a very sad pawn, because you can't even give up on yourself. You don't know where to start even if you overturn the chessboard. No matter where you are, you can be easily wiped out and you can't even jump up. Standing in front of the hospital, he wanted to take a taxi, but for a moment Sudbai didn't know where he should go. Xi'an is a big city, but when his scope of activities was limited here by the terrorist broadcast, the entire ancient city of Xi'an was Sudbai felt like a prison, as if the air was being restrained. The blood corpse should have a deep connection with Jixiang. Sudbai had also doubted whether the blood corpse was a Lychee before. After all, the way the blood corpse appeared, and the action of pulling itself out directly from the pit was really inappropriate. It's like the behavior that a woman like Lychee would do. To put it bluntly, even if he drinks a cup of tea before dying, Lychee will take the trouble to cook it carefully and then drink it before dying, instead of just boiling water and drinking it. Everyone has his or her own style. And sometimes, this style is accompanied by life and death. Walking slowly along the road in front of the hospital, Subai only had a wallet and 2 mobile phones on him. He had no suitcase, so his hands were casually inserted into his belts. He looked like a local homeless gangster in Xi'an. They don't look like tourists, nor do they look like out-and-out local residents. By chance, while walking, there was a small restaurant on the side of the road. Subai walked in and ordered 2 meat buns and a bowl of noodles. The meat buns were authentic in taste here in Shaanxi. Subai remembered that he went to school on the eastern coast. At that time, the rujiamo sold at the small stall outside the school was to put a piece of wholesale steamed bun in the oil pan and stuff it with a few pieces of meat and lettuce leaves. Here, the rujiamo is done. Mo obviously has more sincerity. While eating, Subai took his mobile phone to send messages to the discussion group. Soon, Fatty posted a reply, sending a photo in which the 3 of them were eating hot pot together at a hot pot restaurant in a mountain forest in Chongqing. Looking at this photo, Subai subconsciously took a bite of the rujiamo. He lived here day after day. The 3 of them lived a happy life. After finishing eating, Subai stood up and left the store. The sun was still a bit dazzling. Although the temperature had dropped a lot and there were people wearing down jackets on the street, Subai still felt a little restless. People tend to be a little at a loss when they have no direction, and Subai is like this now. He has no direction at all, no plan at all, just messing around day by day, finishing the mission and leaving immediately is what he wants in his heart. In the huge crowd, Subai found that he had lost himself a little. Perhaps, it is also because of the recent blood corpses that have been too affected, and it may also be related to the previous contacts with Fang Wenhai, Lan Lin, Piao Lu, and Yan Huiyang. When it is obvious that his strength is far from reaching the standard, I came into contact with high-level people I shouldn't have come into contact with, which affected my mentality. Unknowingly, Subai seemed to have lost the steadiness he had in walking up step by step. His steps were a bit frivolous, and he felt like a broken jar. Anyway, those people were so much better than him, and he was also. I just messed around and fell down. Just like an ordinary working class person, his neighbors are all wealthy people. This will undoubtedly put him under great pressure, and even eventually turn into a kind of self-destruction. A hearse drove over from the other side of the road. Subai's eyes fell on the hearse. For some reason, he felt like he was being watched by this hearse. When the hearse passed in front of Subai, it stopped. Many passers-by looked at her in surprise, because in traditional Chinese culture, everything related to funerals gives people a very unlucky feeling, especially when the hearse stopped on the roadside. The car door opened automatically. Subai looked around, then walked up. Then, the car door closed and the hearse started moving again. The temperature in the car was obviously much colder than outside, and there was only one driver in the car. Of course, there was a freezer in the back half of the car, and there was a body lying there. This car should have been taken from the hospital or somewhere to the crematorium for cremation. The car contained the crematorium's employee rules and shift schedules. The driver sat upright and drove the car in a serious manner, but Subai could tell that the driver's face was a little livid, indicating that he was possessed by a ghost, or that he was blocked by a ghost. This phenomenon is quite common among the people. Sometimes when walking at night, you will inexplicably forget something and then find yourself walking to another place in a daze, or you may doze off while sitting in the car and wake up to find that the car is not, it stopped at the original place. These were just the effects of those dirty things. Maybe they just wanted to take a ride. Subai did not go to the cab, but walked to the back half of the car. This was the real owner. The corpse lying in the freezer still looks the same. There is no process for ordinary people to dress up their deceased relatives. It looks very casual. After all, it is shipped directly from the hospital. Of course, it will appear very formulaic, and the process can be saved naturally. I skipped it and sent it directly to the crematorium to be cremated and signed. When Subai walked to the freezer, the corpse inside, whose face was still bandaged, slowly sat up. Halfway through, he reached out and pushed the freezer. It seemed that it was not very convenient to open it from the inside. Subai smiled and helped him open the freezer. "It's so stuffy in there." The bandaged man walked out of the freezer, holding a bottle of Centennial Mountain in his hand. This was the bottle that Subai had poured for him in the morgue. This guy was not willing to throw it away. "Are you going to be sent to be burned?" Subai sat down on the steps, and the bandaged man also sat down tremblingly on the steps. The two of them looked like two brothers sitting together and chatting. "The clothes are old." "Yeah, I divorced my wife. She lives with my daughter in the United States. Didn't I get into a car accident? They didn't plan to come back. After paying the hospital, they went through a backdoor process and asked a foreign relative to sign for me. I was cremated as soon as they got the word. I guess they were also glad that the time from the car accident to my death was short, otherwise they might have really gone to the trouble of making a trip." "Then you are really miserable," Subai said. "Well, I made some money before, and then I went out to fool around and was discovered by my wife. My wife wanted a divorce. I was too loyal at that time and gave all my property to them, mother and daughter, and they went directly to the United States. Now I live in an old apartment and drive a van, and I don't have much money left. They, my mother and my daughter, don't bother to take a fancy to the little money I have left. By the way, thank you for the water. You don't know that I was thirsty. I reached for water while driving and accidentally got into a car accident and died. Although it was very cold in the morgue, it was too dry. I'm so thirsty." Subai shook his head. "You're welcome." At this time, the bandaged man suddenly seemed to think of something and asked, "Do you know the new guy with the red body?" "I don't know, but I might die in his hands," Subai said. "Oh, he came that night and lay in the morgue with me. I was a little afraid of him and didn't talk to him, but I seemed to hear him saying something quietly, some of which I didn't hear clearly, and some of which I heard clearly. Yes, there is a name that seems to have been repeated many times, called." When the bandage man was about to say that name, Subai's breathing became obviously heavier. Obviously, this may indicate the true identity of the bloody corpse, but at this moment, the bandage man stopped talking and stared at the hearse. Rear window. Subai turned his head and looked over. Outside the car window. A bloody and shameless face. He was staring inside coldly.